1 year after Miller's first arrival at the Crystal Court, the Grand Unity celebration filled the capital city with light and music. Crystal beings flew in elegant patterns through the sky, while human artists projected spectacular light shows onto the crystal spires. The city had become a shining example of what two species could achieve together. Princess Aurora stood on the central platform of Unity Point Station, her form radiating patterns of joy and pride. Beside her, Miller watched as ships from a dozen different worlds, both crystal and human, docked at the massive space station. "Did you ever imagine this when you first broke protocol to speak to me directly?" Aurora asked, her harmonics carrying amusement. Miller chuckled. "Honestly, I was just hoping not to cause an interstellar incident." The station itself was a marvel of joint engineering. Crystal technology regulated its power systems, while human design provided comfortable living spaces for both species. Research labs, cultural centers, and diplomatic offices filled its rings, all busy with activity. The Shadow Fleet sent another trade proposal, Aurora mentioned, her colors shifting to thoughtful patterns. They want to establish their own cultural exchange program. From enemies to trading partners in 1 year, Miller mused. That might be our greatest diplomatic achievement yet. Below them, in the station's grand plaza, crystal children were teaching human children how to manipulate light patterns, while human teachers explained the concept of dancing to fascinated crystal students. The sight would have been unimaginable just a year ago. The first speaker, who had become one of their strongest supporters, approached with a delegation of new diplomatic trainees, both human and crystal. His form now regularly displayed patterns of optimism. "The first joint fleet exercises were successful," he reported. "Our ships working together achieved efficiency ratings we never thought possible." Aurora's form brightened, and the new trade routes. "Operating at 200% of projected capacity," the first speaker replied. "It seems when you remove unnecessary protocols, commerce flourishes." Miller watched as a group of scientists hurried past, arguing excitedly about a new discovery. The combination of human creativity and crystal precision had accelerated technological development beyond anyone's expectations. "3 more species have requested to join our alliance," Aurora said, her form showing proud patterns. "They see what we've built here and want to be part of it." The station hummed with energy as more ships arrived for the celebration. Each vessel represented a dream that had seemed impossible just a year ago. The dream of true cooperation between vastly different species. "You know," Miller said thoughtfully, "when I was assigned this mission, my superiors told me to be cautious, to maintain strict protocols." Aurora's form flickered with amusement. "And instead you broke every rule in the book." "Not every rule," Miller corrected with a smile. "Just the ones that needed breaking." A massive cheer rose from the plaza as the Unity Point's central crystal activated, sending waves of harmonious light throughout the station. Human musicians played alongside crystal sound shapers, creating music that combined the best of both worlds. "We've changed the galaxy," Aurora said, her form glowing with contentment. "Not through war or dominance, but through understanding and boldness." Miller nodded. "And this is just the beginning. Imagine what we'll achieve in another year." The celebration continued around them, a living testament to what could be achieved when different species chose to learn from each other rather than fear their differences. Human innovation and crystal wisdom had combined to create something greater than either civilization could have achieved alone. As the 3 suns set behind the crystal world below, casting rainbow patterns through the station's windows, Miller and Aurora stood together, no longer just a human diplomat and a crystal princess, but symbols of a new age of cooperation. "To new horizons," Aurora said, her form blazing with optimism. "To new horizons," Miller agreed, watching as another ship docked at Unity Point, bringing more dreamers ready to join their grand experiment in interstellar cooperation. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. Proof that sometimes the boldest move was simply to believe in something better. The massive crystalline spires of the royal palace stretched toward the purple sky, their surfaces reflecting the light of 3 moons. James Miller stood at the boarding ramp of his diplomatic shuttle, adjusting his formal Earth uniform one last time. He had practiced for this moment for months, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the alien grandeur before him. 2 rows of royal guards lined the path to the palace entrance. Their armor seemed to be made of living crystal, shifting colors with each movement. Their height, nearly 9 feet tall, made Miller feel like a child, but he kept his diplomatic posture straight and proud. Remember, his earpiece crackled with his advisor's voice. No direct eye contact with the princess. Their species considers it a grave insult. Miller nodded slightly, though he wondered how he would avoid eye contact with a being he couldn't even properly see yet. The reports about the crystalline people of this world were fascinating but limited. Their bodies were partially transparent, with intricate patterns of light flowing through what seemed to be their equivalent of blood vessels. As he walked down the path, Miller noticed how the alien guards tracked his movement. Their crystalline forms hummed with subtle frequencies, a sign of either curiosity or distrust. He wasn't sure which. The diplomatic briefings hadn't covered everything about their biology. The grand entrance hall opened before him, a cathedral-like space with walls that seemed to sing with stored light. Standing at the far end, surrounded by advisors, was Princess Aurora. Even from a distance, Miller could see why her species named their royalty after celestial phenomena. Her form was like captured starlight, patterns of energy flowing through her crystalline body in complex, beautiful ways that made Earth's most precious gems look dull in comparison. Miller stopped at the designated distance and bowed precisely 45 degrees, no more, no less. "Your Highness, I bring greetings from Earth and the United Human Systems." The princess's response came in perfect English, though her voice carried harmonic overtones that no human could produce. "We welcome Earth's representative to the Eternal Crystal Court." Her formal words were accompanied by a subtle shift in her color patterns, something Miller noted for later analysis. The first test came during the formal dinner. Miller was seated far from the princess, as protocol demanded for a first meeting. The food served to him was specially prepared. The crystalline people didn't eat organic matter the way humans did, instead absorbing energy through a process similar to photosynthesis. Miller noticed the subtle looks and shifting colors among the court members as he handled his eating utensils. He had studied their proper use extensively, but he could tell that his movements seemed clumsy to them. Still, he maintained his composure, knowing that humanity's future relations with this powerful empire might depend on these small moments. An unexpected moment came when one of the court advisors, his form a deep blue color, asked Miller about Earth's primitive space travel technology. The word choice was clearly meant to provoke, but Miller smiled and responded with carefully chosen words. "We find that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable," he said, noting how the advisor's color darkened slightly, like a crystal's basic structure leading to complex beauty. The princess's color patterns shifted subtly at his response. Was that amusement? Interest? The cultural attaches would be analyzing the recording of this dinner for weeks. As the first formal evening drew to a close, Miller felt both exhausted and energized. He had survived the initial meeting, but he knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the first real negotiations, and with them, the true test of whether humanity could forge a lasting alliance with these remarkable beings. What he didn't know yet was that his straightforward human approach would soon challenge centuries of crystalline tradition, starting with the princess herself. The Earth diplomat retired to his quarters, his mind already working on strategies for the days ahead, unaware that he had already begun to change the course of 2 civilizations. The second day of negotiations started with rigid formality in the Crystal Court's grand chamber. Miller sat at the long crystalline table, watching light patterns dance across its surface. The princess sat at the head, her advisors forming a protective circle around her like a living crown. The trade negotiations had been dragging on for hours. Miller listened as the 10th advisor repeated the same points about proper protocols and traditional methods of resource exchange. He noticed how Princess Aurora's internal light patterns had dimmed slightly. Was she as bored as he was? Then Miller did something that made the entire chamber fall silent. He stood up and addressed the princess directly. "Your Highness, if I may speak plainly." The court erupted in shocked whispers. The advisors' crystalline forms pulsed with dark colors of outrage. No one addressed the princess directly during formal negotiations. It simply wasn't done. All communication was supposed to go through her first speaker. But before anyone could stop him, Miller continued, his voice clear and respectful, but unflinching. "We're talking in circles. Earth offers fair trade terms. We have resources you need. You have technology we can use. Why complicate a simple matter with weeks of circular discussion?" The first speaker, his form now a dangerous deep red, started to intervene. "This primitive dares toe. Let him speak." Princess Aurora's voice cut through the chamber like a beam of light. Her color patterns had shifted to a bright, interested blue that none of her advisors had seen before. Miller took his chance. "Your people mastered crystal technology centuries ago. We've mastered organic computing. Together, we could create innovations neither of our species could achieve alone. But not if we spend months just deciding how to talk to each other." The princess leaned forward, her crystalline form catching light in new patterns. "You risk much by breaking protocol, Ambassador Miller. With respect, Your Highness, sometimes the greatest risk is taking no risk at all." A sound like tinkling crystals filled the room. The princess was laughing. It was something so rare that several advisors nearly lost their structural integrity from shock. "Fascinating," she said, her colors shifting through patterns that indicated deep thought. "You humans are unlike any species we've encountered. You know our protocols, yet you choose when to break them. Not from ignorance, but from strategy." Miller smiled. "We find that sometimes the best way to show respect for another culture is to be honestly ourselves while dealing with them. Pretending to be what we're not, that would be truly disrespectful." The first speaker tried again to intervene, but the princess silenced him with a gesture. She rose from her throne, another break in protocol that sent ripples of shock through the assembly. "Perhaps," she said, moving closer to the human section of the table, "it is time we learn to appreciate directness. Tell me, Ambassador Miller, what does Earth really want from this alliance?" For the next hour, Miller and the princess engaged in the most direct diplomatic discussion ever recorded in the Crystal Court's history. The advisors watched in horror as ancient protocols were bypassed, but none could deny the progress being made. By the end of the session, they had accomplished more than the previous day's formal negotiations. But more importantly, something had changed in the dynamic between human and crystalline diplomacy. As Miller left the chamber, he overheard two junior advisors, their forms glowing with excited patterns. "Did you see how he just spoke to her? The way she responded. I've never seen the princess so engaged." Miller smiled to himself. The real work was just beginning, but he had achieved something vital. He had shown that humanity's directness could be an asset, not just a diplomatic liability. What he didn't know was that his actions that day had sparked something in Princess Aurora's mind. A question about whether her people's rigid adherence to protocol was holding them back from true progress. The emergency alarms pulsed through the crystal walls of the palace, creating waves of red light that made Miller's head spin. He rushed through the corridors, following the urgent summons to the royal security chamber. Something had gone terribly wrong. Inside the chamber, Princess Aurora's form flickered with agitated patterns of deep purple and red. Around her, advisors moved in chaotic patterns, their usual orderly formations abandoned in the crisis. "Ambassador Miller," the princess's voice carried unusual harmonics of stress, "we have intercepted communications from the Shadow Fleet." Miller's heart sank. The Shadow Fleet belonged to the Void Empire, the Crystal Court's ancient rivals. They were known for their stealth technology and brutal efficiency. "They plan to attack the trade convoy," Aurora continued, her colors darkening further. They think destroying our first major collaboration will shatter any chance of an alliance. The first speaker's form pulsed with angry red light. We must respond with full military force, show these barbarians, and risk open war. Miller interrupted, earning more shocked looks that he ignored. Your Highness, may I suggest something completely unconventional? The princess's colors shifted to a curious blue. Speak. The Shadow Fleet expects a military response. They're prepared for that. But what if we give them something they're not prepared for at all? Miller pulled out his datapad and projected a star map. We know their approximate location. What if we send a joint diplomatic mission right into their path? Madness. The first speaker's crystal form vibrated with outrage. You would have us greet our attackers with words. No, Miller smiled. I would have us greet them with a show of absolute confidence. One human ship, one crystal courtship, flying openly toward them. No weapons powered up, no hostile moves. Just two allies showing they're completely unafraid. The chamber erupted in arguments. The advisors' forms created a chaos of clashing colors and sounds. But Miller noticed something important. Princess Aurora's colors had shifted to a pattern he'd never seen before. You believe this will work? She asked, her voice cutting through the chaos. The Shadow Fleet's whole strategy depends on creating fear and uncertainty. Nothing would unsettle them more than us acting like we don't consider them a threat at all. Miller paused. Plus, if we're wrong, you'll have only risked one ship and one expendable human diplomat. The princess moved closer to him, her crystal form casting rainbow patterns on his uniform. You are many things, Ambassador Miller, but expendable is not one of them. She turned to address the chamber. I will lead this mission myself. The resulting uproar nearly shattered the crystal walls. The first speaker actually lost his cohesion for a moment, his form briefly dissolving into scattered light before reforming. Your Highness, the laws forbid. The laws were written before we met humans. Aurora cut him off. Ambassador Miller has shown us that sometimes the boldest move is the wisest one. Within hours, two ships left the Crystal Court's space. One was a sleek human diplomatic vessel, the other a beautiful crystal ship that seemed to be made of frozen light. Between them, they carried a human diplomat who had just risked everything on a desperate gamble, and a princess who had chosen to break centuries of tradition. As they flew toward their potential doom, Miller received a private communication from Aurora. If we survive this, her harmonic voice carried a note of amusement. My advisors will never recover from the shock. Miller grinned. If we survive this, Your Highness, I suspect shock will become a regular part of our diplomatic relations. The crystal ship's response was a pattern of colors that Miller was starting to recognize as laughter. Together, they flew on, about to either prevent a war or start one, neither of them quite sure which was more likely. Behind them, the crystal court buzzed with anticipation, while ahead, the Shadow Fleet was about to learn just how unpredictable humans, and their allies, could be. Space stretched dark and endless before their two ships. Miller watched through the viewport as the crystal ship beside him pulsed with gentle light patterns, a sign that Princess Aurora was maintaining steady communication with her crew. Their sensors detected the Shadow Fleet long before visual contact. 12 black ships, their hulls designed to absorb light rather than reflect it, hung in the void like a cluster of deadly stars. Your Highness, Miller spoke through the comlink. Are you ready to give them the performance of a lifetime? Aurora's response carried an unmistakable tone of excitement. I spent centuries following protocols. Ambassador, I find I rather enjoy breaking them. They proceeded directly toward the Shadow Fleet, broadcasting on all frequencies. Not messages of threat or demands, but rather an invitation to a diplomatic reception. Miller had suggested they treat the Shadow Fleet like welcomed guests who had simply arrived early to a party. The enemy ships held position, clearly thrown off by this unexpected approach. Their usual tactics of intimidation seemed useless against targets that refused to be intimidated. Ambassador, Aurora's voice carried a hint of amusement. Their command ship is displaying signs of confusion. Their energy patterns are completely chaotic. Miller grinned. Confusion is good. Confused people make mistakes. Like now, look at their formation. The Shadow Fleet had unconsciously shifted from an attack pattern to a more defensive stance. Their uncertainty was visible in every movement. Then Miller did something that would be talked about in both human and crystal diplomatic circles for years to come. He requested permission to board the Shadow Fleet's command ship, alone. Are you mad? Aurora's colors flashed with concern. They'll kill you instantly. No, Miller said calmly. They won't. Because you're going to send them a message saying that if they harm me, the Crystal Court will consider it an act of war. And then you're going to withdraw your ship to a safe distance. I will not abandon you. You won't be abandoning me. You'll be showing them that I'm so confident in my diplomatic immunity that I don't need protection. He paused. Trust me, Your Highness. Sometimes the boldest move is the wisest one. She recognized her own words from earlier, and her crystal form shimmered with what Miller had learned was resignation mixed with admiration. The next hour was tense. Miller's shuttle docked with the Shadow Fleet's command ship. Through it all, he maintained an air of casual confidence, as if he were attending a routine meeting. Inside the command ship, he faced the Shadow Fleet's commander, a beam of pure darkness that seemed to absorb light. Miller smiled, pulled out a small gift, a crystal from Earth that refracted light in beautiful patterns, and began to talk. Not about war, not about politics. He talked about art, about beauty, about the way different species perceive light and darkness. He spoke of how the Shadow Fleet's technology for absorbing light could be modified for peaceful purposes, creating unprecedented advances in energy storage. By the time he returned to his ship, the Shadow Fleet had withdrawn their attack plans. More than that, they had agreed to preliminary trade discussions with both Earth and the Crystal Court. As their ships headed home, Aurora's voice came through the comm, her harmonics rich with emotion. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I have ever witnessed. Sometimes they're the same thing, Miller replied. But more importantly, it worked because we did it together. Your trust in my plan gave it credibility. The princess was quiet for a moment. You've shown me that our traditions, while valuable, shouldn't be chains that bind us. Her form pulsed with determination. Things will change when we return. Miller nodded, watching the stars streak by. He had achieved more than preventing a war. He had helped spark a revolution in how two great civilizations would interact with each other and the galaxy at large. The Crystal Court would never be the same, and somehow, that seemed exactly right. The great hall of the Crystal Court buzzed with tension. Miller stood before the assembled nobles and advisors, his heart pounding but his voice steady as he presented his most daring proposal yet. A joint cultural exchange program, he announced, pointing to the holographic displays showing plans for a massive space station. Not just diplomats and traders, but artists, scientists, teachers, and ordinary citizens from both our worlds, living and working together. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Crystal forms throughout the chamber pulsed with colors of shock, outrage, and disbelief. The first speaker's form became so agitated that he seemed to briefly lose coherence. Impossible, he thundered, his voice creating harmonic resonances that made the chamber walls vibrate. Our people cannot be expected to mingle with what? Princess Aurora's voice cut through the chaos like a laser. She stood from her throne, her form radiating patterns of determination that Miller had never seen before. With beings who have shown us new ways of thinking. With allies who face down the Shadow Fleet through wit rather than weapons. She moved to stand beside Miller, a gesture that caused several noble houses to pulse with scandalized patterns. The princess continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Ambassador Miller's proposal is bold, yes. It will change our society, yes. But change is not our enemy. Stagnation is. Miller watched as Aurora's words began to have an effect. Younger crystal beings in the chamber started displaying patterns of interest and excitement. Even some of the older nobles showed colors of thoughtful consideration. Think of what we could learn from each other, Miller added. Your crystal technology combined with our organic computing. Your energy manipulation techniques merged with our transportation systems. The possibilities are endless. A young noble named Bright Edge moved forward, his form shimmering with enthusiasm. I volunteer to be among the first exchange participants, he announced, causing his family members to flicker with embarrassment. But then something unexpected happened. Another noble stepped forward. Then another. Soon, dozens of crystal beings, mostly younger ones, were volunteering for the program. The first speaker tried one last time to maintain control. Your Highness, the ancient laws clearly state. The ancient laws, Aurora interrupted, her form blazing with authority, were written by our ancestors who had never met humans, who had never imagined a species that could challenge our assumptions while respecting our values. She turned to address the entire chamber. We are not abandoning our traditions, we are expanding them. Miller watched in amazement as the tide of opinion began to turn. The princess's words, combined with the enthusiasm of the younger generation, were creating a momentum that even the most conservative elements couldn't entirely resist. The exchange station will be built, Aurora declared. It will be called Unity Point, a place where our cultures can meet as equals and learn from each other. The announcement sent ripples of color cascading through the chamber. Miller noticed that even some of the initial opponents were now showing patterns of reluctant acceptance. Later, in a private meeting room, Aurora's form shimmered with what Miller had learned was amusement. You knew this would cause an uproar, she said. Miller smiled. Sometimes you need to shake things up to move forward, but I couldn't have done it without your support. My advisors think you're corrupting me with human ideas, she replied, her colors shifting to patterns of mischief. They might be right. Not corrupting, Miller corrected. Inspiring. There's a difference. The princess's form brightened. Indeed there is. And speaking of inspiration, wait until they hear our next proposal. Miller raised an eyebrow. Our next proposal. Aurora's crystal form pulsed with what could only be described as a grin. Oh yes, if they thought this was bold, they haven't seen anything yet. Looking at her determined glow, Miller realized that their partnership had evolved into something his diplomatic training had never prepared him for, a genuine alliance of minds that could reshape the galaxy. 6 months after the Unity Point announcement, the Crystal Court had transformed beyond recognition. The once rigid halls now buzzed with activity as humans and crystal beings worked side by side. Princess Aurora stood at the heart of these changes, her form radiating with purpose as she implemented reform after reform. Miller walked through the palace corridors, noting how the traditional barriers between sections had been replaced with transparent energy fields. Crystal beings and humans passed freely between areas that were once strictly segregated. The sight would have been unthinkable just months ago. Ambassador, Aurora called out, her form shimmering with excitement as she approached. Come see what our joint science team has discovered. In the newly established research chamber, human and crystal scientists huddled around a remarkable invention, a hybrid computer that combined crystal technology with organic components. Its processing power exceeded anything either civilization had created alone. This is just the beginning, Aurora announced to the assembled team. Today a computer, tomorrow perhaps ships that can harness both our technologies. The first speaker, who had gradually accepted the changes, albeit reluctantly, stood nearby. His form still showed traces of discomfort, but even he couldn't deny the results. The old ways had their wisdom, he admitted, but perhaps change isn't always a threat. Miller watched as a young crystal researcher demonstrated the new computer to a group of human scientists. There was no protocol, no rigid ceremony, just genuine enthusiasm and shared discovery. Your reforms have spread beyond the palace, Miller commented to Aurora as they left the research chamber. I saw crystal merchants in the city adopting human trading practices. Aurora's form pulsed with pride. And humans in the diplomatic quarter are learning our color language. Did you know some have started wearing crystal-enhanced clothing that can display emotional patterns? They reached the grand balcony overlooking the capital city. The skyline had changed too. Human-style buildings now stood alongside crystal spires, creating a stunning blend of architectures. "There's resistance still," Aurora admitted, her colors showing concern. "Some noble houses fear we're losing our identity." "Change doesn't mean losing who you are," Miller replied. "It means growing into something more." A group of crystal children flew past the balcony, their forms trailing light as they played with human children in hover suits. The sight would have scandalized the court just months ago. Now it drew smiles, or the crystal equivalent, from most observers. "The younger generation understands," Aurora said, watching the children play. "They see possibilities where the old guard saw threats." The princess had also changed. Gone was the rigid formality that had once defined her rule. She now moved among her people freely, her decisions guided by wisdom rather than tradition alone. "The other royal houses are following our lead," she continued. "3 more crystal worlds have requested human diplomatic missions. They want what we've achieved here." Miller nodded. "Earth's government is getting similar requests from other crystal worlds. Your revolution is spreading." "Our revolution," Aurora corrected, her form glowing warmly. "None of this would have happened without your boldness showing us another way." As if to emphasize her point, a delegation of mixed human and crystal diplomats passed below, heading for the newly established Interspecies Council chamber. They'd moved together naturally, their differences forgotten in their shared purpose. "There's still so much to do," Aurora said, her form showing patterns of determination. "The military integration program, the education reforms, the new trade protocols." Miller smiled. "One step at a time, Your Highness. Though I must admit, your pace of change would make even the boldest human reformer dizzy." Aurora's form flickered with laughter. "Perhaps that's the greatest revolution of all. A crystal being teaching humans about the speed of change." Together, they watched the sunset paint the crystal city in brilliant colors, each thinking about how far they'd come and the greater changes still to come. The crystal court was transforming into something new and wonderful, and the galaxy was watching with growing interest.